Cloak of Obscurity, Chapter 4. At the Roots of the Great Rose. Considering the circumstances of her death, Alison's body would have been taken to the Great Rose Temple and laid out in the crypt until the funeral. She had no living family to keep vigil over her, which was fortunate. What I needed to do would be much easier without anyone who knew her around to protest. I arrived at the temple just after the third bell prayers. A smattering of clerics and other folk went about their quiet business in the incense-scented coolness, murmuring prayers at the various brightly colored altars. I went to the shadowed, black-hung alcove devoted to Saint Morgana, Judge of the Dead. A wooden door behind the altar opened to a broad flight of stairs leading to the crypts beneath the temple. Tracing a star of protection over my breast, I descended into the dark. The crypt was tended that day by a priestess of Morgana, old and wizard enough to be mistaken for one of her silent charges if she held still too long. She sat at a reading desk, poring over a book, her wrinkled white face the only thing illuminated by the lanterns hanging beside her. The heavy folds of her black robe melted into the shadows around her. I had almost convinced myself that coming was a very bad idea when she looked up at me with surprisingly clear black eyes. "Good morning," she said, in a voice like a rusty hinge. "Who are you? And for whom have you come to pray?" "My name is Edward Redmage," I said. "I have come to see the body of Alison Tanner." "Are you kin?" the old woman asked. "I am a friend of her household." Not a lie, but not exactly truth. I was friends with the Tanners' servants, not the Tanners themselves. The priestess unfolded herself from her chair and lit a second lantern, which she handed to me. I followed her between rows of rock-hewn columns into a little side chamber. "Her body is here," said the priestess. "Would you like to be alone?" "Yes, please," I said, thankful she seemed disinclined to ask too many questions. "Call when you wish to leave," she said. "Quietly. This is a holy place." She turned and made her way back through the winding maze of columns, her shadow wavering out behind her. Even in midsummer, the crypt was freezing cold, which was as it should be. My job was going to be grisly enough without heat, decay, and flies. Alison lay decently covered on a slab to one side of the chamber. Shivering, and not from the chill, I hung my lantern from a hook in the wall and pulled back the sheet. I could still recognize her. That was the worst part. Her face was ice blue where it wasn't black with bruises, and her eyes had been reverently closed with coins, but she was still the headstrong, handsome girl I had so briefly known. I found myself blinking back tears at the waste, the injustice, the unfairness of it all. She had been a creature of love and loveliness, and now all that had made her what she was gone, leaving only a cruel mockery of her beauty behind. I presumed the acolytes had removed her clothes because she had been washed clean of the sand and seaweed that must have covered her and clothed her in a pure white linen shift. Her arms were folded across her breast, and her ankles were modestly crossed. Forcing myself to look at her face again, I saw scarring on her nose and lips. I wondered if fish had been nibbling at them, and shuddered. Her fingers and toes were marked the same way. The fingers of her right hand were especially damaged, the skin torn away from the fingertips. Telling myself it was necessary, I pulled the shift up enough to see her bare legs, and then moved the sleeves. She was scraped and battered, as if her body had been tossed by violent waves against sharp rocks. I looked at her head. The acolytes had done a remarkable job of washing and combing her fair hair, but they couldn't hide the fact that the left side of her skull had been bashed in with a horrific blow. I couldn't hold off any longer. I had to cast the spell. "Saint Dana, forgive me," I murmured. "I have no wish to desecrate your holy work, but I can see no other way to find this girl's killer." I stripped off my coat. Rolling up the sleeves of Damien's shirt, I opened my bag and laid out all I needed. The incense, the candles, a crystal, a small silver dish, and a very sharp knife. I gently lifted the coins from her eyes. Without warning, as though the coins had been all that was keeping her balanced, her head fell to one side. After a few tense minutes waiting to see if the old priestess had heard my terrified squawk, I noticed that Allison's jaw had fallen open, and there was something green in her mouth. Gingerly, I reached out to touch it. It was a strand of the long, tough seaweed called mermaid's hair. I tried to pull it out, but it was longer than I expected. I pulled a bit harder, drawing it gently from the dead girl's mouth, and trying not to gag myself at the sight of the slimy rope coming from her scarred blue lips. It was over a foot long. I realized she must have swallowed it, as she had gasped for a last desperate breath she would never take. She had not been beaten to death. She had died by drowning. But how? Why? Had she been pushed into the water, or had she thrown herself into the sea? I felt that there was only one way we could find out. I picked up the knife. This was the point at which I realized I really had no idea what I was doing. I knew how to perform the spell over Allison's eyes once they were out of her head and in the dish, but I had no idea how to remove her eyes without damaging her eyelids, and the last thing I wanted was for anyone to be able to tell what I'd done. I hesitated, realizing just how ill-planned my venture to the crypt had been. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" a man's voice bellowed behind me. My knife flew across the crypt. I jumped at least a foot in the air, stumbled, and landed on my back. Malcolm landed on top of me. I could tell by the way his fist landed on my face, he didn't like the looks of what I'd been about to do to his late girlfriend. "You freak!" he cried. "You monster!" I'm sure he had a lot of other things to say, but I passed out about the third time my head hit the floor. For the second time that day, my mind swam into consciousness and regretted it. "Hold still, you young fool." I recognized the voice of the old priestess as she dabbed my forehead with some ointment. "You're lucky I found you before that girl's lover committed murder on holy ground." Of course, I felt as if I might have been better off dead. I still had all my teeth by some miracle, but my lips were swollen so I could hardly speak. I couldn't open one eye, and if my skull had been dented like Allison's, I would not have been surprised. "He's seeing Allison coffined at the moment," the priestess continued, "so you've got a few minutes to explain to me why you thought you had the right to perform a spell on a corpse without consulting me, the deceased kin, or your order." Well, I tried to think of a lie. One wouldn't come. Probably just as well. "I didn't think Malcolm would allow it." She shook her head. No, boy, you didn't think at all. Oh, I know you suspect him of doing the girl in himself. We all do. Lover's always the most likely killer. If it would do a bit of good to take the girl's eyes out, I'd have had the king's wizard down here myself. But it won't. She's been dead too long. That spell only works within a day of death. You should know that. She must have seen an expression of shock cross the mobile half of my face, because she chuckled dryly and said, "Surprised? An old woman knows your trade better than you. I've been serving the White Lady over 40 years. Not much done with corpses I don't know. Drink this." She handed me an exceedingly bitter tea. "Now, I should let the king's wizard know what you've done, or tried to do here," the old priestess said. "Of course, he'd probably revoke your charter and banish you from the city." I opened my mouth to protest, realized the old woman was absolutely right, and shut it again. "But you're obviously young and ignorant, and I'd hate to see you without a chance to learn from your mistakes. So I'll handle your punishment myself. And you'd better remember you're getting off lucky." Someone knocked at the door. "Who is it?" the priestess called. Malcolm burst in, looking as if he wanted to check my face for spots he'd missed. "Where is it, bastard?" he demanded. "Where is what?" the priestess countered. "Allison's ring. She wore a silver ring on the third finger of her right hand. I gave it to her. She never took it off. Now it's missing. It's not on her hand, and it's not with her clothes." He glared at me. "That freak took it." I didn't want to take that lying down. "I didn't take it," I tried to shout, my voice slurring. "How dare you accuse me?" I forced myself up from the couch. "Would you like to search my things?" I grabbed my robe from a nearby shelf and tossed it to the floor, then upended my satchel on top of it. "See if I have it." Ignoring the pain in my head, I stripped off my shirt and threw it at Malcolm. "You want me to take off my hose?" "That will not be necessary," said the priestess, taking my arm in an iron grip. "Lie down before you hurt yourself." I obeyed quietly, worn out by my outburst and with my head still throbbing. "Now, Malcolm," said the priestess, still keeping her remarkable calm, "I don't remember seeing a ring when that poor girl was brought in, but I'll ask the sisters. Violet?" she called down the hallway. A soft pattering of feet brought a black-robed acolyte to the doorway. "Yes, Mother Lillian." "Was that sad young lady wearing a ring when she was brought here?" the priestess asked. "No, Mother." "Are you sure? A silver ring on her right hand?" "No, Mother, she wore no jewelry at all. I am certain of that." "Thank you, Violet. That will be all." She dismissed the girl and turned to Malcolm. "It seems," she said, "that the ring was lost before Allison was brought here. It is possible it was stolen by the fisherman who found her body, or even one of the guardsmen who brought her here, but—" She shook her head. "If you will pardon my saying so, it is very hard, if not impossible, to take a ring from the hand of a body drawn from water without cutting off the finger itself. And her hands are untouched." She sighed. "Go home, Malcolm, and pray for God's aid. There are those in this city who think you might have had a hand in this tragedy." Malcolm laughed bitterly. "That hairy ogre," he said, pointing at me. "If he said so, he's only lying to save his little brownie friend. For he knows where I was the night Allison died." He smirked. "We had a little conversation in front of a tavern, didn't we?" "That was you?" I thought that left hook felt familiar. You didn't recognize me? Malcolm said, incredulous. He could tell by my one open eye that I hadn't. He guffawed. Saints and sinners, you must have been drunker than I was. He narrowed his eyes. Bit of advice, magician. Butt out. Stop worrying about my household. Wizard, you've got plenty of trouble of your own. He left without saying goodbye to Mother Lillian. How rude, said the priestess. No manners. She turned and looked at me, her glare boring into me. No common sense, she added. You need to stay away from that Malcolm. He's likely to try and use you as an alibi now. Well, he wasn't pummeling me all night, you know, I said. Well, lucky you. I could go to the tavern, find out when he was there. That's a good idea. Mother Lillian approached my bedside, armed once more with linen and lotions. But not today, she said. You can rest up here until you feel steady enough to go home, and then that's where you're going. You need to be in bed, young Edward, was it? Any nosing about you need to do can be done tomorrow. I lay still and surrendered to her treatment. The ceiling was a very restful shade of blue. I began drifting back into unconsciousness. Allison was drowned, I mumbled to myself. What did you say? Asked the priestess. She drowned, I repeated, still half conscious. Really? Mother Lillian raised her silver eyebrows. What makes you think that? Seaweed in her mouth. Swallowed it. Mother Lillian shook her head. The sisters didn't find it. I'll have to have a word with them. Now let me lift your head. She began wrapping a bandage. Of course, if she did drown, and she wasn't bludgeoned, the priestess continued, then how did she get that knock on the head? Landed on a rock, I mumbled. That makes sense, said the priestess, nodding. The ones north of the city, most likely, because I can't see how someone could have thrown her from the city walls without it being seen. And that means she must have died at high tide, because that's the only time the rocks north of the city are underwater. If we can find out when the tide was high, that night we'll know when she died. I'll find out. I know sailors. I tried to stand. Oh, no, said Mother Lillian. I will find out about the tides. I'll talk to a priest of St. Marina I know. You, young man, are going to rest. And another thing, she added, when you feel stronger, in about 2 or 3 days, you're coming back here to see me. There's still the matter of your penance to be worked out. You've set about to mutilate a poor dead girl's face at the very roots of the house of God and all his angels, and deceived a priestess about your intentions on top of that. And don't you think I'm going to let that pass? I didn't lie to you, I protested. No, but you surely didn't tell the whole truth, she said. I turned my face to the wall. Oh, I can see you're an impatient, headstrong young man, Edward, and it's getting you hurt. Yes, come back in 2 days, 3 at the most, and we'll see what can be done to teach you to stop and think before you act. As I left some hours later, I gave Mother Lillian my promise as a God-fearing, honorable man that I would return to the temple. I did not, however, promise to go straight home. I wanted to visit Lee in prison. I was very worried about him. I shouldn't have been. When the head jailer let me into the cell, after payment, of course, I found the boy crouched warily on his pallet of straw in a nest of blankets. He'd apparently been reading one of my books by the light of a candle. 2 half-empty baskets of food sat on the floor beside him. I hoped it was a shadow and not a rat I saw flicker away from the baskets. "Well, don't you look cozy?" I said. Lee leapt to his feet, nearly toppling the candle. "Master Edward, what happened to your head?" I shrugged. Malcolm introduced it to the floor of the temple crypt. I was trying to cast a spell to find out what happened to Allison. I'm beginning to think it was a bad idea. "Sit down, Master Edward," Lee said, pulling me towards his pile of straw and blankets. "Are you hungry? Look, there's scones." My stomach uttered a plaintive growl, but all I said was, "Oh, I can't take your food, Lee." "Oh, don't worry, I've got loads," he said. "Both Dolores and Sadie came and brought me things. This here," he said, indicating the baskets, "is just the leftovers." "Sadie came herself?" I asked, settling down into the straw. "Yes, she brought me a huge bowl of fish chowder at noon. Have a scone or something. I don't need it. I'm stuffed, I promise." I laughed. "Well, with Sadie coming to feed you up, it's a wonder you can even move," I said. "She thinks you're too thin." He grinned back. "She thinks anyone who can still see their feet is too thin." "Well, then I must be on my way to pleasing her," I said. "My loving cousin Damien called me pudgy straight to my face today." "That sounds rude," said Lee, scowling. "What were you doing to that talking to that pompous ass anyway?" "Lee," I protested, "don't call him that." "Why not?" he said with a gleam in his eyes. "You do. Anyway, why were you talking to him? And what was Malcolm doing clobbering you in a crypt?" I didn't want Lee to know what I'd been planning to do to Allison. Besides, there was probably a jailer on the other side of the door with an ear plastered to the keyhole. Well, I was trying to find out more about how Allison died by looking over her body, and Malcolm did not appreciate my concern. I decided to change the subject. "You're holding up much better than I thought you would, Lee. This morning, I was afraid you would die of pure terror." Lee drew close to me, putting an arm around my shoulder and whispering in my ear, "I'm still scared, but I can't let anyone see it. The only thing keeping those guards from gang raping me is the thought that I'm your lover, and you'll use your magic to rip their spines out through their assholes if you touch me." "Lee, language!" The boy scowled. "I'm just telling the truth," he whispered. "If I show fear, they'll think you can't protect me." He had a point. "I'll get you out of here," I said. "As soon as I can, I promise. I'm going home now. See you in the morning." "Sure you don't want to eat something before you go?" I shook my head. "No, I'm saving my appetite for Sadie. She's going to have a fit when she sees my head. And her cure for everything is eat, eat, eat." "Exactly." I tousled the boy's hair and left. As I exited the jail, I could almost feel the stares of the jailer and his lackeys piercing my back. I forced myself to stand straight, with the attitude of a man who could kill with a word, rather than slouching in shame at being thought a boy buggerer. I suppose that any chance of a decent marriage with a decent woman was a small thing to sacrifice for the sake of Lee's life. I knew if the crowd in the jail got hold of him, he wouldn't likely survive. I pulled my hat down over my black eye, wouldn't help my act if folk could see someone had beaten me up, and quickened my pace. All I wanted at that point was to get down to the East End, where folks were too busy surviving to pass judgment on each other. "St. David's flesh and blood, Eddie! Who's done this to you?" cried Sadie when I unwisely took off my hat in front of her. "It's a bit of a long story," I sighed. "I don't suppose you'd mind if I told you over supper?" "Anna, get this boy some of that chowder," Sadie ordered. "And Eddie, you sit down and tell me everything." After a day of tromping from one end of the city to another, I was ravenous, and Sadie's fish chowder is wonderful. I put it away with great enthusiasm. Sadie sat behind me and kept refilling my bowl with undisguised pleasure. Between mouthfuls, I told her of the day's adventures, leaving out the more unappetizing details, of course. "So was that Malcolm who blacked your eye the other night?" Sadie said. "Yes, he seems to have a special skill for pummeling me." Sadie scowled. "How could anyone have anything against a dear lamb like you?" "Well, I don't know about that first time, though I think he was drunk. Today, he did catch me trying to cast a spell over the body of his sweetheart." "Oh, you were just trying to find out who killed her?" "I think he was trying to stop her, Sadie declared. "I think he tossed her into the sea himself. Of course, he'll tell everyone he couldn't have, as he was rearranging my face at the time." Sadie paused, but only for a moment. Anyone who would harm her precious pet wizard had to be a villain. "Yes, but he could have paid someone else to do it. Or he did it and then went to the tavern to start a fight, so folks would think he hadn't done it. Look into it." I chuckled. "Certainly, Sadie, I'll look into it tomorrow." "Of course, tomorrow. You're having your supper now." Sadie beamed at me, her round, greasy face shining with affection. "Flesh and blood," she sighed, "but it does to an old woman's heart good to see the way you tuck in." I chuckled. I wasn't sure of her age, but I suspected Sadie was no older than my eldest sister. "Sadie, dear, you're not an old woman." "Oh, you think so? Let me tell you, Eddie, you're aged twice as fast, living on the east side. Here, darling, have some more." I suddenly realized I couldn't remember how much I'd eaten, but I was starting to feel rather full. No, thank you, Sadie. I've had plenty." "Nonsense," she answered, spooning more into my dish. "Eat up. Fish is brain food. It'll help your head." "I'm not sure it works that way." "Oh, sure it does. Now finish this off for me. Remember, waste not, want not." "Waste not, get fat," I countered. "And what is wrong with a bit of fat?" Sadie demanded, fists on her ample hips. "Keeps you warm in winter." "Sadie, it's midsummer." She shrugged. "Well, you'll be ready when winter comes then." Realizing there was no arguing with her, I loosened my sash and ate the chowder. Now, Cloak of Obscurity is the first book in the Edward Red Mage mystery series, as if you couldn't tell by Eddie's complete self-absorption and lack of clue. The fourth book in the series is hopefully going to be ready for release sometime this summer. I've just gotten the draft back from my editor and cover art back from an artist, so things are moving right along. And Cloak of Obscurity and the other two books in the series so far are available for digital download through Amazon and other retailers. Thank you for your support. And the kitty cat thanks you too if she were awake.